All right. Good evening and good night. Good evening for the ones calling from Europe, and good night for those of you who are calling in from Indonesia. And well, thank you for joining us, because we know this is a very late hour for all of you. My name is Remco Vermeulen, and together with my colleague Arjuna Kandotti, we co-organized and co-moderate today's session on reflections on how Indonesians are dealing with Dutch colonial heritage. I will just go through some of the practicalities, the logistical announcements for today. We hope to have a short break after the second lecture. And we hope also to finish this session around 9 p.m., which we will try to be very strict with the time because of our Indonesian guests, of course, and to give them the opportunity to finally go to bed. There will be ample time for you to ask questions. Although, of course, we hope to cover all of the questions that you have. If your question cannot be answered, I apologize in advance. Please post your questions in the chat box. You can just post them there while a lecturer is talking, and Arjuna and I will keep an eye on the chat box and read out your questions and post them to the lecturer when we have the chance. If you have a question for a specific lecture, please also add that to the chat. Is there anything else logistically I need to tell right now, Arjuna? No? Oh yes, please keep yourself muted. If you're not muted and we hear you, we will mute you. We will do that for you. That's the service of the organization. All right, now without further ado, Arjuna.
Yeah, thank you, Remco. The topic of this evening will be reflections on the use of Dutch colonial heritage in Indonesia. And for this, we've invited three wonderful speakers, Ajeng Arainikasi, Febe Sukmani, Angelina Basuki. So thank you for joining us. This evening, we will be talking about that in recent years, increasingly historical inner cities in Indonesia with their distinctive Dutch colonial buildings and infrastructure are being revitalized. And more these urban areas transform from no-go areas to popular places for leisure. And among these local attractions are also museums. And many of these museums, either national institutions or centers for local culture, are housed in colonial buildings. And with these three speakers, we will address several questions, and some of these are, is this relaxed and positive attitude towards these tangible and often prominent reminders of the country's colonial past typical for the Indonesian audiences, and why? How do they view the Dutch colonial past, and how will these heritage sites be used in the future? And do they need to be decolonized to stay relevant? Well, then it's time for the first speaker.
Yes, thank you, Arjuna. The first speaker is Angelina Basuki, and she is a project manager of Consortium Kota Tua Jakarta. I think it's also important to mention to you all that all the three speakers, they are of course working at certain institutes or organizations, but they will tell about their work for these organizations sometimes, but they are speaking on their own behalf, so not on behalf of their institutes. That's just a small disclaimer for this evening. So Angelina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Remco and Arjuna. Let me share my screen. Okay, hello all, good evening, good night. I'm gonna share my experience and work of what we did with consortium in reusing colonial heritage buildings in Kota Tua Jakarta. First, I'd like to mention that Jakarta, or any other names, Sunda Kelapa, Jakarta, Batavia, is a strategically located melting pot in Southeast Asian maritime dating back to 13th century. So let me introduce the consortium place that I worked. Back in 2013, the governor of DKI Jakarta who's now our president, Joko Widodo, instructed to establish the consortium Kota Tua Jakarta to take initiative and synergize with other stakeholders in Kota Tua Jakarta to revive the area and develop Kota Tua Jakarta as special economic zone. So we did the math, like we tried to do the math, what we should do to revive the area and to develop Kota Tua Jakarta as special economic zone. And we came up with, there are heritage buildings, obviously, in Kota Tua Jakarta, and there are building owners who mostly at this case, it's a state-owned enterprises that actually used to be nationalized Dutch companies post-independence, whose main focus of the business probably not always related with maintaining the property. It would be banking, insurance. We see that there's a gap because with the nationalization of these buildings, comes with the inheritance of the heritage buildings as well, along with the enterprises. So we try to fill the gap that these abandoned heritage buildings owned by the state-owned companies by knocking their doors and proposing our idea to preserve and operate the buildings, and then to insert new activities inside it. So we did that with several state-owned enterprises, and after that we have to apply several strategy after. So first, we got like a dozen of buildings in Kota Tua Jakarta with different kind of previous use for mostly offices, warehouse, banks, and we try to curate the programs by complementing with the pre-existing activities, which mostly museums at that time. So try to make people stay longer, even better to live and work in Kota Tua Jakarta in order to revive the district. So we decided to insert the program on the buildings like boutique hotel, galleries, marketplace, and open air cinema, co-working space, other marketplace from these abandoned buildings. And then the next strategy, it would be the intangible part, that we acknowledge that we cannot work by ourselves. So we work along with several other organizations and institutions, local, international, and also communities to create activities, mostly temporary ones, because we wanted to have to provide some reason to make people also want to go back to Kota Tua Jakarta after they visited them. So this one, for example, Kantor Pos, which we had a gallery in Kantor Pos with contemporary art permanent collections, but also with temporary exhibition as well, which unfortunately only ran for 2 years. And then we also did Old Town Jazz series every 2 or 3 months between 2017 to 19 by using several recently conserved buildings of ours, just to invite different kind of new communities to Kota Tua Jakarta, as well to reintroduce this building to the public. And yeah, this one also Art Hotel Week at Cipta Niaga. So there are several activities like fashion show, concerts, exhibitions with young emerging artists, and pop-up markets. So in general, the partnership and collaboration we did with the institutions and organizations, and then we also sublet some of the spaces that we maintain to small to medium enterprises with different kind of activities, and also conducting activities and events that are more temporary. I like to show the realization of the previous strategy that we had 5 years ago. For example, this one previously it used to be an office, and now it's a co-working space. So like if you want to work in Kota Tua Jakarta, please come. And below that, there's this some kind of experiment. We try to make space for illegal street vendors because they're kind of a huge problem in Kota Tua Jakarta. So we offer them an affordable space with better infrastructure to level them up, and at the same time reactivate the buildings. Yeah, this one the same but for culinary. And yeah, we had cafe, hostels from a warehouse previously, Trick Art Museum previously also a warehouse. And I also would like to mention that one cannot be the messiah of Jakarta, Kota Tua Jakarta revitalization. So there's also other stakeholders initiative for the past 10 years, especially many restaurants, new hostels opening up, and more cafe. But behind all those exciting new movements, there are also challenges and opportunities that I'd like to share. First, the technical maintenance, like humidity, groundwater, leaks, floods, termites, land subsidence, corrosion, record walls, utility installations. Well, basically, I kind of concluded that my ultimate nemesis in maintaining the building is the water. and then also we have social and environment issues like wastewater and waste management, safety and convenience for especially for women and vehicles and pedestrians, and also small medium enterprises management, which are the illegal street vendors I mentioned earlier. Another challenge, and that could also turn into opportunities, the cooperation, investment, and regulation. We are yearning for model for cooperation with state-owned enterprises, investment-friendly environment, easier permit, and tax relief. I intentionally put this to picture because well, we invested like billions in this tool, but because the lack of the model of the cooperation with state-owned enterprises, that after 5 years they decided to put the building to auction after all the things that we did. And for this one, Kantor Pos, after 2 years, they decided to maintain themselves by making a holding company that focus on building management. Actually, for our common goal to reactivate heritage buildings, it's pretty good movement for Kantor Pos because they got many other properties in Indonesia. But for us, it's a disaster. It's a nightmare for the financial health. So that's why I think we really need investment friendly environment both for us and our potential tenants. And also would like to say that I've been privileged to with working with consortium to meet different kind of people from architects, historians, entrepreneurs, politicians, and communities, different kind of communities. But they all have their own ideas and expectations, and with such limited resources and space that we have, actually it's quite challenging for us to accommodate and to fulfill all of these expectations, like how we can make everyone happy. So I think it's one of the biggest challenge for us.
Yeah. Angelina, are you still there?
Were once colonized, and it is also it is also running in our hang. Today, we are riding our bicycles here. Okay, that's all.
Universitas Indonesia, and you will give a presentation on the developments of museums in Indonesia at the moment. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Arjuna and Remco. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ajeng. Thanks for inviting me to this lecture. It was such an honor. And tonight, I will tell a story from Indonesia about museums in colonial building. When Remco and Arjuna asked me to do this lecture, my research is not really about the buildings, but about the narrative of the museum. So I'm started to asking around why so many Indonesian museums house in colonial buildings. And based on my own research and of asking people working in the heritage sector and museums, I got at least 3 general answer. Of course, the first answer is the availability of the existing space. So when you want to make a new museum, it is cheaper for you to put it in an old building oh, not really old. I mean, that's already existed space rather than you have to build a new building from the beginning. And some people also believe that to present history, it is better to put it in historical places, or so they use historic building or colonial buildings, or sometimes it's to tell the history of the particular place or institution in that particular building, or to preserve colonial buildings, to attract visitors, or to decolonize it. The third factor is depends on what political regimes you are in. So we start from the New Order. In 1942, when the Japanese came to Indonesia to colonize Indonesia, there were approximately 25 museums established in colonial Indonesia by the Dutch colonizer. So that colonial era museums were mostly nationalized during the New Order, and when they located in provincial in the capital city of a province, then they became the provincial museums. If not, if there's province have no museum, so the government built new museums, and they are also creating many resistance museums. And with their centralized approach, their approach is top-down, anti-colonial narrative, and military history. So during early years of independence, colonial buildings were considered as undesirable heritage. So they reuse colonial buildings in order to decolonize them. I have a case study here, a little bit in the same spot with Angie, but a little bit more specific. The first story is the Old Batavia Museum. You can see the old picture. It's the Old Batavia Museum. It was established in 1939. It was to celebrate 350 years anniversary of Japekun. The museum was located in former warehouse in a former old church where the graveyard or the tombs of Japekuns and other VOC officials were found. So they created the facade, really looks like Dutch house. And it's telling the story of the Batavia and its inhabitants with old furnitures and things. The museum survived, and in the 70s, when Ali Sadikin, Jakarta's governor, revitalized the old city, he moved the museum, the old Batavia Museum, into the former city hall and renamed it Jakarta History Museum. He then used the old building into Wayang Museum or Shadow Puppet Museum, and established another 2 museums about Indonesian culture and history in colonial buildings. And what about the narrative of the museum? At first, and at that time, they didn't call it decolonizations or decolonizing. They just think of how to make a museum a little bit more nationalized. So the anti-colonial narrative is very strong at that time. So Ali Sadikin commissions very giant paintings from Indonesia's famous painter Sujoyono, showing the war, the fightings between Sultan Agung, a Javanese king, with Japekun. And of course, to put the history of Batavia, Jakarta, to show that Jakarta is not only started from Batavia, they put the pre-Batavian artifacts like ancient inscriptions from ancient kingdoms before colonial era, and even prehistoric artifacts. It's to show that Jakarta is not only Batavia. Another prominent example from the New Order is the Fort Vredenburg Museums in Yogyakarta. In the 1950 city map of Jogja, it is stated that the fort is only considered as fort without any names. But now it is became one of the most popular tourist destinations. In the 1980s, in the 1970s, they want to reuse the fort as cultural center, but the plan being changed in the 80s, and it is intendedly decolonize the fort into a resistance museum. So the museum telling there's diorama, about 50 dioramas about the resistance of Indonesia from Diponegoro era to the New Order period. And during the Japanese era, that particular fort was used to intern Dutch and Indo-Dutch. And of course, that story is missing. You can find the story in museums in the Netherlands, but not in Indonesia. So that's the narrative. And very quick example is the narrative of the Museum Gula or Sugar Museum. If you came to museums in colonial buildings that tell the story of colonial era, so usually you found the story of the Dutch or the Europeans or Indonesian royals or bosses, but not the social history of the commoners. The ordinary people are missing or missing. In this sugar museum, you can find the story of the bosses and the technical things, like how do you produce sugars and the technology. But for the workers, there's a lot of Dutch sources, sometimes in Dutch language, sometimes in English, telling a Japanese coolie digging a trench. So the narrative is top-down, no social history, no decolonial narrative, and it's still commonly found sometimes in some museums up to the present day. But how about after the New Order reign? Is there any changes? Of course, they are no longer centralized. They are a centralized approach. So the approach depends on each province policy. And when in the New Order, there's a lot of oppressions. So after that, the used to be oppressed started to be appear. So there's untold and hidden stories started to be appear, and the history of a marginalized community, and it started to be a bottom-up approach, no longer really top-down. And interestingly, the colonial buildings is not really considered as undesirable. We use it now to preserve them, or sometimes it to attract visitors and as an icon. For example, after the former president Abdul Rahman Wahid revised the policy about the Chinese Indonesians, there's a lot of Chinese heritage museums started to appear in many cities in Indonesia. For example, in Medan, maybe this is the most famous one of Chong Afi, a very wealthy merchant of Chinese Medan at that time, and we can still visit his house as museums. Or in Tangerang, nearby Jakarta, there's a house, but it's more telling about the history of the community of Cina Benteng there, Tangerang Chinese Peranakan. And even at the moment, Yogyakarta's government is preserving the Jogja's Chinatown and the house of its Chinese Kapitan to be open as museums. And there is city museums started to appear everywhere, and most of them using colonial buildings. Not only in Bandung or Makassar or Bali, but also in Surabaya and many other cities. Maybe the reason why is because of you tell stories of history, so you put it in historical places. So they reuse also the historical buildings such as City Hall, or for Bandung case, it is former school, former kindergarten, or in Bali, it is in the ex-old port. It is the former office of KPM, shipping company, and things. And also, these days, the companies that is nationalized from Dutch companies started to transform their colonial buildings, colonial heritage, into museums in order to preserve that. For example, the Bank Indonesia, it used to be the Javas Bank. Since 2006, they started to transform their colonial buildings into museums in many cities. For example, in Jakarta, Jogja, Bandung, Surabaya, Padang. So they became sometimes mini museums, sometimes big museums, in order to preserve the buildings as their heritage. This approach is also done by Indonesian Railway Company, PT KAI, PT Kereta Api Indonesia. They got museums in Semarang, in Ambarawa, Bondowoso, Sawah Lunto, to preserve their former office and old train stations. And one interesting thing is the heritage icon. So you can see here is a Gedung Sate Museum in Bandung. Gedung Sate in the 1920s was built for the Office of General Affairs, but it became the government building of West Java. And now they have museums inside the building to tell the history of the building. And became the icon of the city of Bandung. But what is more interesting for me is the Museum Tanah, or the Land and Agriculture Museum in Bogor, because when we talk about Bandung, of course we know the Gedung Sate. But when we come to Bogor, usually for ordinary people, their icon is the Kebun Raya, the Botanical Garden. But in 2018, this Museum Tanah was rebranded. It already been there since 1988, but in 2018 they have the agriculture museums in the building back at the old building. And I read in the opening statement of one of its officials that they particularly use that buildings to hope that in order that this museum and this particular building could be the heritage icon of Bogor. It is interesting. They particularly choose colonial building as heritage icon. And this, of course, this building was once laboratorium of agriculture during the Dutch colonial era. So it's a continuity of telling the history of particular races. And the last case study I got here is the Sawah Lunto. It is in West Sumatra. It used to be a former mining town. And in 2019, they became UNESCO World Heritage. There are a lot of museums there. For example, the Gudang Ransum Museum, it is the museums about kitchen, common kitchen, and the coal museums, and also the train station museum, the Sawah Lunto Train Museum, and many other museums, most of them in historical colonial buildings. The first reason is because of they are now became World Heritage Site, so it is hard to build new buildings, so they reuse old one. And but the most interesting one is the initiative of its municipal government. They asked UNESCO to help them, and they want to tell the stories from the bottom up approach. So they want to tell the difficult history of slavery from different communities. So there are more point of views to be included, and also balance history, because they really, of course, wants to understand how the stories of the Dutch also as the former employer in Sawah Lunto, not only from the side of the former slaves. So it is quite interesting. But is it a decolonial mindset already? Of course, no, because there is no decolonial policy from the central government. So it really depends on personal level, or at least provincial level, who is involved in the making of the museums. If the persons like in Sawah Lunto municipal government, they understand and they would like to do the colonial narrative, so it's happened. But if they are not, so there's no decolonial point of view. For example, and it is I didn't put the wrong hand to anyone, but it is because of our what do you call it? Our effects of colonizations for years. For example, last month I was in Aceh, giving lecture for museum personnel for the whole province, and we are doing like an exercise practice in the old Dutch cemetery. There is 10 groups. I asked them to write labels of one grave, whatever grave, it's okay. And 8 out of 10 groups choose the Dutch generals, Dutch military personnel for writing the history, for writing the labels. And none of the groups choose any Indonesian soldiers. Although there are many Indonesian Knil soldiers here, the Javanese or Ambonese Knil that is available, but they used to tell the stories of the colonizers. So and the colonial mindset is not yet really what do you call it? It's not really understand by most Indonesians. The words decolonial also is not familiar for many of us. So that's my story for tonight. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ajeng, for this super interesting presentation. All right, so we now have some time for questions before we have a short break. After the break, we will come back with like a panel. So then both Arjuna and I will ask Angie and Ajeng some questions, but we can also take some questions from the audience. And then after Feba Sukmana will give a reflection on both these presentations. And after that, there is the Q&A in which you as the audience can ask all the questions you have for either of the 3 speakers. But maybe now first, a quick question, Ajeng, for you, from me. So you showed us a lot of examples of museums that are housed in Dutch colonial buildings. Can you tell us a little bit about how popular those museums are? Like, are they well visited by people?
Some museum, yes. For the bigger one, yeah, but of course some smaller one not really that popular. But a lot of museums are very popular. Like in Makassar, there is also their provincial museum is in Old Fort. Yeah, and it was stated as the most successful reuse of colonial forts in the present day.
All right, and that's also, it's popular as a museum or also popular as, I don't know, like a wedding destination or like an event venue or?
Event venue, of course. There's a lot of event happens in, for example, in Vredenburg or Rotterdam. Yes, but for wedding venue, I think it depends on the museum. I'm not sure.
Maybe just for wedding pictures.
Yeah, pre-wedding, of course.
All right. Arjuna, if you allow me, I'll just ask another question to Angie. Yeah. Angie, thank you for your very nice presentation. I was just wondering, the buildings that the consortium manages, it's 9 in total, right?
Currently 9. Yes.
9 buildings, yes.
Let go a couple of them.
Yeah, and you told us how you have looked for different functions for these buildings to attract new types of communities or new target audiences, right? So we saw, like, for example, hostel and a magic 3D world, but also a Jamu cafe, which is super fancy. It looked. Can you tell? Sorry.
Third wave Jamu.
Yes, exactly. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the users of these buildings, so that is both the tenants that are running the new businesses, for example, but also their guests or their clients, how they how they regard, what do they think of these colonial buildings that those new businesses are housed in?
Well, you actually quite different target for each one. So like for example, the Jamu Cafe, usually they could attract middle to upper class, mostly for locals and also foreigners. But for the co-working space, it's actually working quite well because they engage with many different of communities, and they're doing lots of events, even podcasts and public library. So like other than they have allocated space, if you want to work there, they also have this multifunction space that you can use for different activities. Almost every week changing. And actually the top level of the co-working space, there's also CSR from Bank Indonesia. It is used as a mosque because the majority of the Indonesian are Muslims, and they need the 5 times prayer. So yeah, I think it's quite different kind of visitors that we receive, and all of them responded it quite positively. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Maybe
and
then
also
okay. Sorry, go.
For an addition, there are still several buildings that still empty, and they are quite popular for pre-wedding photo shoot.
No, I think it's an interesting trend, or I don't know, to see. Like I often see photos of like Dutch colonial buildings, whether it's the Benteng Rotterdam in Makassar or indeed Kota Tua, like the Taman Fatahila, where a lot of people, like young couples, take their wedding photos on those historical locations, but they're like also Dutch, like colonial locations, not like traditional Indonesian historical locations or mosques or whatever. Can you say, like, I don't know, like, do you know why, like, it's popular with people to take, for example, wedding photos there?
I'm not sure, but okay, from my own experience, I did in my own buildings, of course. So I guess there's this romanticization, with the past. I think it's not only happening in here, but also anywhere else. I'm not saying that I won't say that it is only for colonial buildings. Actually, there are also wedding photo shoot for in Candi, in temples, for example. So it's not only always about the colonial buildings, but more of the romanticization of the place.
All right. Well, I think that's an interesting topic. Maybe we can talk a little bit further about that in the second half of the event of this lectures evening. I think Arjuna, is it okay if we go to the break now and then continue with the panel after? Yes. All right. Well, then I would like to open the break now. We have 5-minute break. Let's continue at 20:24 right now, Dutch time. So 5 minutes at least for our Indonesian friends. See you in a little bit.
Okay.
And continuing. Welcome back, everyone. That was a very short break, but that was also to make sure that our Indonesian friends don't fall asleep in the meantime. We're going to now continue with the second part of the program. So we'll take some extra time for questions with Angie and Ajeng. We have some questions of our own, but of course, if they're the questions that are posted in the chats, I saw a few already, we will post them as well. And then afterwards, we will give the floor to Feba Sukmana for the reflection on both the presentations. All right, Arjuna, do you already have a question for either of our two?
I think it's for the both of you. You both gave examples of decolonial practices. Ajeng, you actually mentioned involving the local community to feature narratives from a local perspective. Could you elaborate a bit more on this? For example, how do you train your students to prepare for this?
For the example that they do the decolonial narrative is in the Sawah Lunto. I have nothing to do with that. It's the initiative of its municipal government of Sawah Lunto. They asked UNESCO for help, and they really wants to put the stories bottom up from different communities about the slavery history of Sawah Lunto. But for my own, I know that there is many things to do. So I'm starting to, and it's really when people ask me what is your research about, and when I'm telling them decolonizations and museums in post-colonial Indonesia, and then they will ask like, what that? So the words decolonization or decolonial itself is not really popular in commoners in Indonesia. I mean, not it's the word used in academicians or you're working at the governmental levels or museums, but maybe in a big cities, but not really in local regional museums. And for persons not working in cultural and heritage and museum sectors, usually they have no ideas. So what I am doing with my students is just putting the ideas of that on, like, for examples, in Aceh, after we discussed about the museum labels, I'm discussing that why don't you tell the history of the Indonesian person? You said Aceh is having a love-hate relationships with the Dutch, with the Netherlands, but you just tell the history of the Dutch. Why don't you tell the story of your own? And the people was like, oh, okay, iya juga ya gitu. Oh, okay, yes, you're right. So we didn't think of that before. So we're there's a long way to go, but we're starting to do things like this or talks everywhere. It's helping, hopefully.
Yeah, and how do people react to that?
Yes, yeah, they are think that, oh, there's a new perspective point of view that we can try to do so. But usually people then ask later again, like, so but how exactly can we do that? But you can't really answer that questions because it really depends on the museums. I mean, museums have a different history, has a different story. So when you have to decolonize the museums, particularly the narratives, so it really depends on your content. So it's not like a general recipe that everyone should do A or B, but you have to do it differently in different things. But they are starting to do so. For examples, in Bogor, there is a national natural history museums. So it used to be ethnobotany museums. They rebranded it into National Natural History Museums, and they have new exhibitions. And there's a lot of stories of the Indonesian people that involved in botanical gardens in Bogor, particularly. Not only the bosses, but also the workers in the colonial era who helped the botanists. Ayub, Ais, Ayep, whoever their names are, and they put the stories. I'm really happy to see that. Like, wow, good job, nice job. So they are started to do so, even though it's still many yeah, still much work to do.
That's lots to do, but nice steps to take also.
Yeah.
So thanks for that. And for you, Angelina, because you mentioned that you work together also with the local community to do programs. Do you invite them? Do you co-create with them together?
Well, not always we're inviting them. Sometimes they're knocking our doors. So yeah, different kind of activities and also different kind of communities. For example, we had several exhibitions from this community called Ogungu. It's mostly they're this small community with young emerging artists in Jakarta. And then there's also the communities from the photography and entrepreneurs, even the yoga communities. We had yoga inside a heritage building. So yeah, the many of them.
Can I ask a follow-up question, or did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah. Please go.
All right. Thank you. Angie, sorry, did you want to say something?
No.
Oh, okay. You were just leaning in to listen to what I had to ask. No, it's interesting. So you basically had a consortium is focusing on like the restoration and the redevelopment and the maintenance of the buildings that you have under your management, right? So that's these 9 buildings that you said, that you told us about. I know that you told me in one of the meetings we had before that consortium is now kind of basically focusing on the technical aspect of this. So basically, how do we make sure that these buildings get a new function and that they get, that they are used and that they're popular so that people actually come to these buildings and to this area. At the same time, of course, these are buildings that were built by the Dutch, so the former colonizers of Indonesia. Does that in any way affect the way in which you as consortium are dealing with these buildings, or the way in which these buildings are being promoted or, I don't know, seen by other people?
Yes and no. Well, first, I think regarding the past, regardless who's building the buildings, who built the buildings, we always did a research with PDA, if you know. We did a research with all of these buildings. I mean, regardless who built this building, they already a heritage by the list and by the status and everything. So it's really very technical actually. So we did the research and we consult with the agencies that related with heritage projects in Jakarta as well. So yeah.
Right. I see many questions popping up in the chat, but I see a follow-up question from Nanette. Could it be the architecture?
Okay. And if I may add, regarding with the Dutch, actually, I don't know if you're expecting some darker response, but actually, we have quite good relationship with the Erasmus, for example. Like there are several exhibitions we've been hosted with them. So
Erasmus House, you mean, right? The cultural center of the
yes.
Dutch embassy in Jakarta.
Yes,
okay.
yes. Mm.
Yeah, you have a good relationship with them, as in for programming, you mean?
Yeah, for the activities inside the buildings.
Right. Yes. All right. I have many more questions, but maybe I'll also take a few questions from the chat at this point before we move on to Feba. I saw a question. One of the first questions that came in was from Jeroen Overwil. He asked you, Angie, how do you feel about the Indonesian government actually leaving Jakarta and nothing happens on protecting the area, Kota Tua, for example, but most of Jakarta, against the sea and the surface lowering each year? Big question.
Threatened and hopeless. Okay. No, actually, yeah, it is something that not that far in the future. I think in the next 20-30 years, it is said that probably 30% of Jakarta will be, below the sea water level. But at the same time, I knew that there are several research that's been going on for quite some times, and I know with the Netherlands, there's this research called NCICD, the National Capital Infrastructure for Coastal Development. And then there's also another giant seawall research going on here. So it's not like the Jakartans or the Indonesians do nothing about it. I know that there are some research going on and some reclamation islands, which is quite controversial. Yeah. So I don't know if it's answering the question, but yeah, I feel a bit hopeless, but I want to hope that the the research and what's going on currently with the reclamation projects could be the answer to save Jakarta.
Maybe the work of consortium is so well that they feel like we should protect this area. So maybe you're part of the solution.
Too tiny part.
Yeah, well, another question Dan asked, to what extent is there a discussion on what narratives Kota Tua could express? Who is joining this discussion? I think this one is also for you, Angie.
What?
So who is joining? Is there a discussion going on what narratives Kota Tua could express, and are there who is joining this discussion, who are invited or participating in this discussion?
Yeah, I think there are several FGDs, every now and then, sometimes held by the cultural agency, some other time by the tourism agency, and yeah, to be honest, I also I'm also waiting for what narrative that we want to bring for Kota Tua, because for example, recently there's this movement, like a joint venture between the state-owned company and the local government-owned company for Kota Tua, and it was mentioned during the official ceremony that they want to turn back the name of Kota Tua Jakarta into Batavia. I mean, without any further reason. So honestly, I'm excited with that there are many people interested in Kota Tua these days. Many agencies interesting and ministries are interesting to talk and discuss more about Kota Tua. But I would like to see more integration between this institution as well. From the public part and also inviting the private part. So yeah, so that we can have this narrative and decide what we want to do next for the space.
Yeah, Dan, does this answer your question, or do you want to add something?
Thank you, Arjuna. Yeah, I hope my internet is sufficient. Calling in from Spain at the moment. Yes, I thank you for your response, and also I think I recognize the problem that you are talking about, and also that's why I'm very enthusiastic about this event, where we actually making a connection between the museum world, which has much more an expertise on expressing the narratives, and spatial planning and development of and preserving architecture. I think the two always have to be intertwined, and this is a great opportunity, I think, to team up and to look into a narrative next to preserving the buildings and looking at more the city infrastructure. Like you said, it all has to be mixed together, and that's quite a challenge.
Yeah.
But thank you for your response, and also both, when I have the opportunity, thank you both for your excellent presentations. It's been very interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan. Very nice, and thank you for joining us all the way from Spain. Maybe now is a good time to go to our third and last speaker of the evening. After we can continue with this Q&A. But Feba Soekmana, can I ask you to have your presentation? First, of course, I will introduce you. Feba is a journalist, and she works for the Erasmus magazine, which is the independent magazine of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And Feba, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to see how I can, yes. Hello, good evening and good night for friends from Indonesia. I'm going to take a little reflection on post-colonial narrative based on the presentation of Angie and Ajeng, and it's in Indonesia and in the Netherlands. Okay, so upon hearing the presentations of Angie and Ajeng, one thing came to my mind as a common thread of both stories is identity. And before we talk about how identity affects the discourse, I want to start with the differences between Dutch and Indonesian historiography, because we're talking about the narratives in the Netherlands and in Indonesia. So I think we have to start from the beginning, which is the historiography. So according to Martin Bossenbroek in the book The Raak van Diponegoro, the character of Dutch historiography can be divided into four perspectives. It's victimhood, perpetratorhood, heritage, and science, while the Indonesian side of historiography are nation building, perpetratorhood, and heroism. That's why you see a lot of heroes in Indonesia, national heroes. We have like hundreds of heroes there. And I think this is important because, in my opinion, it will show us the dynamic in the Netherlands and in Indonesia for the narrative of the post-colonial narrative. And how is it in Indonesia? As we saw Ajeng's presentation, but also Angie's, There were differences in how the New Order regime and the post-New Order regime handled the historical representations in museum. So like from royals to common people, and like a lot of things happening. But one thing that you always see is that Indonesia continues to deconstruct their identity. So the from the colonial identity, the colonial time, they form it into a new national identity. And the fact that Indonesia was coming out of the colonization as the winner, it plays a big role in the narratives of the post-colonial representation in Indonesia. So let's see. And Angie also has told us about reusing, repurposing, and redefining colonial buildings. And by doing this, I think Indonesia takes back their agency. Of course, I have a lot of critics about this kind of projects, and the capitalism is under, you know, like sometimes for me, it feels like it's some kind of plastic surgery where you only make things beautiful and that's it, and without really working on the inside. But looking at this development with a post-colonial lens, you can interpret the action as an attempt to build a new identity. But the pitfall is historical amnesia. So people always say that that Indonesians only look forward, they have moved on and they are not dwelling on the past. And I guess it's because the characteristic we talked before. Indonesia doesn't have perspective in on victimhood and heritage. So when there is something from the past, like colonial buildings, we bring it, so Indonesians bring it into the present and for the future. So we make Kota Tua an Instagrammable and a very trendy place, a place where you can like have your I don't know, pre-wedding pictures taken, or the place where you can, you know, take pictures for your Instagram. And the pitfall is, like I said before, amnesia. So the young people or future generation, they don't link the place of these historical places to, they don't have the link from what now it is to what it was. And like Angie also said, like, yeah, can you imagine that maybe a couple 100 years ago there are people killed in this area of Kota Tua, and now it becomes a place for your pre-wedding pictures. I couldn't imagine to have a pre-wedding pictures where genocide happened, for example. And this is also the dangers of it, that the young people see these places as some kind of without context, and it rises the nostalgic feeling, like Angie also said. It is all about romanticism of the past, while they don't really understand the past because we don't learn it properly, or while they don't really experience the past. And that is Indonesia. So I find it very dangerous for young Indonesian people to be trapped in the rising nostalgic of the colonial past. And how about Netherlands? Talking about nostalgia, the Dutch is the winner, I guess, because every time I talk to Dutch people during my first years living in the Netherlands, I always heard words like tempo dulu, or pelan-pelan, or rijsttafel, senang, and all the words about the good old time. So they see the colonial period, maybe not anymore, but you know, like the common people tend to see the colonial period as the good old times. It's about the pride of a small country having a giant colony in the tropic. I think that's the idea that's still occupying the Netherlands up until now. And the Dutch people were also proud of the imperialism, because a couple years ago there was a survey about how proud the European countries of their imperialism in the past. In the Netherlands, only 6% of the Dutch people are ashamed of the past, and around 50% is proud and would love to have a colony. And you can read this interview as well with David van Reybrouck, the writer of Revolutie. So with all of that, the question is, decolonize or not to decolonize? And as I always say, like, it is a wonderful time to be alive, because the last 5 years I start to see changes in the narrative in the Netherlands. So as you can see, there are quite a few books and also movie. This is from the Oost or the East in Indonesia. You can watch it on Mola, if I'm not mistaken. So there are books and there is movies. There are popular publications. There is an exhibition of Revolutie. There is a research from the government about the Indonesian perspectives of the historiography. So you see that there is movement in the Netherlands this couple of years. Nevertheless, the debate about the colonial past in Indonesia, in the Netherlands, the Dutch debates, has always been bumpy. And you might remember one of the characteristics that I mentioned before about Dutch historiography. From the four of it, the narrative of victimhood is still very strong in the Netherlands. And in combination with the Dutch pride, the national identity, it caused friction, and it caused a stir in societal debate. Because, to be honest, it hurts to talk about what you have done in the colony for most Dutch people. And of course, there is nothing more painful than deconstructing. This is a very difficult word, deconstructing identity for a country of past colonizers, because as a Dutch person, who are you if your ancestors were not so great as the narrative in your country? So who are you if they were not a great adventurous trade nation? And who are the Dutch people if they weren't the one building a civilization in Dutch East Indies? Just to be clear, they didn't build the civilization in in colonial Indonesia. And this also apply to specific groups in the society, like for the Indo-Dutch people, for example. Who are they without the pain of their forefathers? And who are they if they were not only a victim but also a perpetrator? And for the veteran, it's also very painful because they came to the colony in order to bring back the order in Indonesia. But what if all of what they have been ordered based on the lie? So to give you an illustration for Indonesian friends, to give you the illustration of how sensitive it is in the Netherlands, maybe we can talk about ourselves. Like, Indonesians are very proud. We are very proud to be Indonesian. But who are you? Are you still proud Indonesian if the base of your nation, like right now, starting from the new order, is based on a lie? Like that, what if the communism is not the one to blame in the chaos of 1965? And what if are you still proud to be Indonesian when you see like your fellow Indonesian murdered and raped Chinese people in 1998? And who are you? Are you still proud to be an Indonesian when your country colonized Timor-Leste and still do the same with the West Papua? So that's kind of illustration of how deep the wounds is in the Netherlands, and how sensitive it is to talk about the colonial past. And talking about the debates and all the bumpy roads we have been through and still we have to go through ahead. Now what? What should we do as Indonesians, but also as Dutch people? Well, to be honest, I don't know. Because in my opinion, both the Netherlands and Indonesia have to continue to decolonize and deconstruct their identity, however painful it is. And I have to say that I'm very happy to see some development in the Netherlands, but sometimes colonial practices still occur even in the decolonial projects. Like, I get the idea that the Dutch government involved Indonesia just for the sake of ticking a box, like in the colonial research or exhibition Revolusi. And it is also the same with Indonesia. Like, Indonesia has a lot of problems that we don't want to acknowledge, like from social inequality, racism. We have all of that, but we don't want to acknowledge that. So Indonesia is still in denial, but we still have to face the problems sometime soon. And I hope in the context of Dutch in Indonesia, we can, we don't have to be friends. I think, like, I understand if there are some sensitive parts of the history, and we don't have to have the same narratives. But as long as we can stand as two countries with like balanced power and equal position, then it's good enough for me. I think that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Feba, for this. Well, how do you say that? You gave us a lot to think about. Let's put it that way.
I still have to think a lot.
Yes, but that was also a bit what we talked about. That would be your contribution, right?
Has to be.
So thank you for delivering. No. All right. I see it's actually already 9 o'clock. So I do hope that our Indonesian friends, and particularly Angie and Ajeng, are still awake. Would you mind to continue maybe for like 10, 15 minutes more, so we have some time to address the questions that the audience has?
Yeah,
okay?
Sure. I already wake up fully.
Oh, you're very good. All right, but let me first maybe start with a question for Feba. Yeah, I'm glad that you already posed that question at the end, like, now what? And that you don't have the answer. I guess none of us have. It is interesting though, like, I would like to know your opinion. So you see the presentations that both Angie and Ajeng gave about how, for example, Dutch colonial buildings are currently used in Indonesia. And at the same time, you have like all these, yeah, exactly what you said. We live in exciting times. The day doesn't pass, and there is another article about the Dutch colonial period in Indonesia, and mainly it is, of course, Dutch discussions, a Dutch struggle, basically. How is it to see these two different developments in both countries happening at the same time?
Well, actually, I'm quite optimistic about it because, some people said like, yeah, nothing changes, not in Indonesia and also not in the Netherlands. But I see like young historians starting to have like broader point of view. So both Indonesian and both Dutch historians And I also see like Indonesian people are starting to get involved in the discussion. It didn't happen like 10 years ago. I moved here in 2007, so it has been like 13 years. So this development, I saw it like the last maybe 3 or 4 years, that you see Indonesian names in the media. And also in Indonesia, there is a growing community of people who are interested in the history, because the website historia.id, it has like 17 million followers. It's like the whole Dutch the whole Dutch people were following the Historia. So it's exciting time. Of course, it's still a bumpy road to go, because it's not only a matter of identity, like I told this evening, but it's also a matter of practical issues, like how is it going under the law, like juridical side of the story, but also political side of the story and the economical side of the story. So it's very complicated. I understand. I don't know, for common people like me, it's like very simple. Like, come on, this is just common sense. And this is like just being sensible and being, how do you say it? Just being sensible. How hard could it be to respect each other's point of view and live side by side? But apparently it's not that simple.
Once emotions come in play, it's difficult to stay rational.
True.
Right? Yeah. All right, Feba, thank you so much. Angie and Ajeng, maybe you have also some questions on what Feba just presented? No.
I have a question for Angie.
Oh, you have a question? That's also okay.
I'm digesting the questions.
So because Angie, you are working in Kota Tua, so you are there like most of the time, right? How do you see like young people enjoying the place in those historical places? Do they know the context? How do they see these places right now?
Well, I think they acknowledge the past, because they're like at least 200, more than 200 heritage buildings, and I don't think that every single one of them has to be, a museum that telling the stories of the past. Like we have several distinctive architecture heritage buildings that became the museum, so to remind us about the past. But then the other hundreds of them, it is less distinctive architecturally, but it didn't make it less significant, because it is still part of the urban fabric of Kota Tua Jakarta. So yeah, I think it's what we are doing, like what consortium is doing is trying to complement that, and at the same time we know that the capability to serve or to provide the information already covered by we have Museum of Jakarta History Museum, and then there's this Wayang Museum and the Fine Art Museum. So each building already represent different narratives. So I think as it could also represent the whole district as a whole.
But do you put like the context of the buildings? Because here in the Netherlands you see like the statue of J.P. Koen, or big names from the Dutch East Indies. They are still there, but you put like a new how do you say it, context, like this person has done this and that in Dutch Indies. So just to give the context that what you see is not always the hero of the story.
Okay, maybe I could give an example. So I just noticed when on my way back, I saw that Museum Mandiri used to be the NVM. I think it's a Dutch bank that was nationalized after the independence. So in the building of Museum Mandiri in Kota Tua, now they also redo the original signage of the Dutch name of the building. And I'm thinking that at first why they do this, but then I remember that inside the museum, actually they already put the story behind it. So like how this different four Dutch banks nationalized into Indonesian banks, and then the name changing and the merging happened after the 98 monetary crisis, and now it is called Bank Mandiri. So yeah, I think some of the public buildings already acknowledge the backstory of it.
Right, thank you. Let me see if there is some questions in the chat we still have to address. I saw there was some communication, some answering of questions already by others in the audience, which is great. It's very efficient. Oh, maybe this is a question from Guus Roosendaal for Angie. So you now run or manage 9 buildings, but how many buildings are there still left in Kota Tua to be renovated and reused by consortium? Yeah, what is basically your future targets?
I think we're going to focus on this 9.
On these 9 that you have. And maybe then a very practical question for you as well, Angie. Like, how is consortium funded? Like, how do you pay for the restoration and redevelopment and maintenance of the buildings?
Well, at first it was established with endowment funds from several huge companies in Indonesia, mostly developers. But after the consortium was made, then we decided to make it into a company instead of foundation, because foundation only, spending money. So we decided to make the entity into company, so we could eventually self-sustain our financial by subletting it to other tenants and events also. Yeah. Well,
Right.
we hope that we could generate. Well, currently, actually, the rent only covers the operational, but we do expect that in the future we could generate more, so we can acquire more abandoned buildings and just redo the whole preservation and then subletting it. And something like the Dutch did with Stadherstal, actually. But I think the difference is Stadherstal, they got the chance to actually own the buildings, where in our case we can only rent the building from the state-owned companies because they own the buildings and they're not allowed to sell the buildings. So yeah.
Why are they not allowed to sell the buildings?
Fishy for corruption.
All right.
Yeah, they're not allowed to sell their assets unless for special cases like the one we had with the building Olveh. It was designed by Schumacher, Wolf Schumacher. I said that we have invested billions, and then after 5 years, the owner decided to put it on auction because they were like facing bankruptcy if they don't sell their assets. So the Ministry of State-owned companies allowed them to let go several assets that we can do nothing about because they're the owners anyway.
All right, thank you. I think I'm going to go towards wrapping up, but I will do so with two questions. One question is still, I think it's addressed to you, Angie. It's a question from Julia Patovang. 14 years ago, I researched the old walls of Batavia. Does it still exist? Do they also maintain this type of historical ruins? Back then, it was only the western part that still existed.
Only very tiny part of it. It is located in Lodan, in the north of the current Plaza Fatahillah, so near Sunda Kelapa, and unfortunately, it's not really in good condition. 5 years ago, we did some kind of proposal to not recreate, but to make some kind of markers along the city wall, but we didn't get the chance to realize it. But yeah, the city wall remains only really small parts.
Small parts, yes.
And it's really so it's really in not so good
state.
Yeah.
Well, it's at least there's still some parts left. Maybe that's the positive aspect of it. Even kijken, I have a last question for Ajeng from Hans Bonke. He asks, even kijken, where is he now? There you go. How do you see the development of the museum narratives in the future, like the dioramas?
Personally, I am not the fans of diorama. I think it is in the 80s, and today in museums you have many more approaches, like the participatory 5 senses approaches, in order to make the visitors also can be part of the exhibitions. So I think in the future we have to include more the visitors and people in communities into the museum exhibitions. The example is like this: when you have your phone, there's social medias. You can be the creators, not only the viewers, but you can create contents, share, connect. That's changed your life, and that's what museums supposed to do with their exhibitions, not manually or digitally. It depends on their budget, but the visitors can no longer only be viewers. It is not the way we are living in this world. So museums have to be changing with the way we are living at the moment. I know there's museums in Netherlands, in Australia started to do that. So Indonesian museums have to do that as well, even though it's still a long way to go to be there. But that's my opinion.
Your humble opinion, yes. All right. Thank you very much, Ajeng. I hope Hans that answered your question. Feba, I also wanted to ask you a last question, but we already addressed it. How do you see the future of where are we going as two countries with a shared, a common or shared, however you want to call it, history? But I think you already. Do you have some last thoughts on this?
Well, I hope we developed a sharing. it's very difficult to answer this question, because of course I hope there is a common how do you say it okay, let's put it this way. I have 2 daughters, and I hope that I don't have to work on my own to give understanding to my daughters about the colonial past of the Dutch and the Indonesians. So I hope that the narrative, there is a common understanding of where we were back then. And I think as now we don't have to carry our the wounds of the past. We don't have to carry the wounds of our ancestors. I mean, like, Indonesians did things to the Dutch people, and the Dutch people did a lot of things to Indonesian people. Of course, as nationalists, it's very hurtful to see this. But I think I don't want to say like let bygone be bygone, because it's very cliche for Indonesians, because we always say things like that. But at the same point, at some point, it has to be like that. Like, we cannot live in the past, and we have to build our understanding towards the future with our baggage from the past. I don't know if it makes sense, but
yeah, it does make sense, and I think it's a very nice way to close off this evening. I would like to thank our 3 lecturers of this evening: Angelina Basuki, Ajeng Arai Nikasi, and Feba Sukmana, for your very, very interesting and food for thought contributions to our little program this evening. Thank you very much. Thank you especially to Angelina and Ajeng for staying awake in the middle of the night. I really, really super appreciate it that you guys are here live with us. And Arjuna, I also want to thank you for co-organizing this with me. I have some 2 last announcements, particularly for those interested to join another of the ICOMOS Netherlands lectures, which we organize monthly. During the pandemic, of course, we have organized them online like this via Zoom. But hopefully, since the most of the corona measures have been lifted in the Netherlands, we are currently looking into going back to our original physical location in Amsterdam at Dutch Culture. And we probably are going to look at also like a hybrid variation, so that we live stream from Amsterdam, and then we can still have this opportunity of having international guests, but also international speakers. The next lectures evening will be on 13 April, and we will then talk about Brasilia in Brazil and the evolution of the modernist ideal with 2 speakers, Paul Meurs and Carla Costa. And another announcement I wanted to make, and that is particularly for ICOMOS Netherlands members, is on Saturday, 23 April, the focus group Shared Heritage will organize an excursion in Rotterdam about the traces of the colonial history of Rotterdam. And shortly you will receive more information about this. All right, then 18 minutes past 9, I would like to close this evening. Thank you all for joining us, and see you next time. Bye-bye.